Introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Gad Limp here. How are you doing, Gad?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm good. It's been a good afternoon.
It's been very interesting afternoon. Yes, great, interesting discussions, lots of new insights, different points of view. And we're finishing the afternoon talking about assessment. How do you like half an hour talking about assessment, Gad?
I'm ready for us to get going.
Tell us a little bit of your experience with assessment standards in general. What have you done in your very rich professional life in relation to this?
Well, with regard to standards, actually one of the areas of research that I actually focus on quite a bit is on standard setting and its theory. And so I have applied this both with tests of English language proficiency, but also US K-12 school tests. So, these different contexts actually create different issues and challenges for standard setting. So that actually is part of my work in an area I find very interesting.
Thank you. And what have you seen in terms of assessment standards throughout the pandemic? Were they enforced, maintained, dropped completely, kind of temporarily suspended? What happened overall?
Well, I think we need to distinguish between standards and standardized testing, right? I think during the pandemic, there has been here in the U.S. a suspension of standardized testing in some contexts. Accountability testing is an obvious example of that, and we can argue that that's not an unreasonable thing to do because, if you test people, there's going to be a lot of noise. It's because of the pandemic, and you don't want to penalize people on that basis. But I don't think at this point in time the standards themselves are being suspended, though. I think in the U.S. context there is definitely quite a movement around questioning standards themselves. I think when we talk about international student admissions into U.S. higher education, which is are the context that we have in this afternoon's webinar, I don't think we've seen a suspension. If anything, we've seen an expansion that as the traditional English language proficiency tests that people use have not been available because of suspension of in-person testing, that other options have come up that enable people to continue to test.
Yeah, definitely. So what are the assessment standards necessary to support students and institutions at the same time?
Well, I suppose when you get right down to it, it's actually the ethical thing to do, right? Coming to the United States, often represents quite a substantial investment for many international students, right? And they sometimes have scarce financial resources, and so it's probably not quite ethical to accept them if we know they're not likely to succeed, right? Then they're not able to engage once they actually arrive. And so I think that's probably the reason why testing really hasn't been suspended. I mean, I think there probably are other official, more official or legal reasons behind this, but I would say just even at that basic ethical level, that it is, I think, part of higher education institutions' duty to make sure that they're doing the ethical thing.
Many institutions throughout the pandemic, obviously when testing was not possible in many ways for months, even international applicants wanted to consider studying in the US, but they had fewer options to be able to show their English proficiency or to certify their English proficiency for those official results that they needed to submit. So many institutions have had to adapt and change those, either their admissions requirements or they went test optional or accepted no exams, or some temporarily in some cases. What factors do you think institutions need to keep in mind when making all these changes in those policies and the assessments, the standards that they're implementing?
For those of us in assessment, it always comes down to validity, right? And then I think for users in general, it comes down to fairness. So I think, the expansion in the kinds of qualifications and proofs that people are willing to accept is a good thing, because, there are many people out there in the world who possess a variety of test scores and qualifications that prove their English language skills. And, it really is a shame if they're not able to use these. I suppose the flip side of this, of course, is that these proofs may vary in quality, and, you don't want to take as proof something that, doesn't really prove anything. I think that's something that people who are in international admissions, I think they get this. On the one hand, they're happy to improve accessibility, by accepting these additional ones. But I do know that in general, they are concerned in, if I accept these, is this something I can defend? And is this going to work out for us? So yeah, I think it's important for them to keep in mind, that, how good are these tests, right? An additional one I would think is that I've seen, obviously, in the pandemic, that in addition to your typical English language proficiency test, that temporarily people were accepting, scores, let's say on an SAT subject test, as being, sufficient proof. In that case, things are more complicated, right? Because the test itself was not primarily meant to measure English language proficiency. So there's probably somewhat more work for people to do on, where do you set the standard in order to ensure that somebody with that score coming in is in a good place to engage.
Mm-hmm. And kind of in relation to at-home testing, and which is absolutely necessary at this point, and remote testing and testing students who are being proctored remotely, I'm sure many of the people in the audience are wondering about test security and how important it is, and how it's important to kind of enforce that. What can you tell us about what you would expect of good test security measures for remote testing?
Well, as someone who has worked on test security and malpractice for quite a bit of time, I would say that, between at-home testing and in-center testing, there isn't one mode that's inherently more or less secure than the other. There's no single security measure that's going to be 100% secure. And that's why, testing organizations will employ a multi-layered approach, hopefully, with security measures that are there for, before the test date, during the test, and after the test event. With in-center testing, you might have greater certainty that, they haven't brought in contraband into the testing room. So in that sense, in-center testing is safer. On the other hand, with at-home testing, it's harder for the test taker to collude with a proctor, try to compromise them and pay them off, right? So you can see that depending on which test mode you're going with, they have different strengths and weaknesses. And a responsible test organization will, take a close look at the particular strength or weakness of that mode, and then put in appropriate measures. And, as far as remote proctoring, we talk about remote proctoring as if they're all created equal, but we know that, different remote proctoring services have different levels of human and AI technology in there, and different levels of intervention, and whether they're doing live proctoring or whether it's post hoc reviewing of things. Are they allowed to stop things in the middle, or is it just afterwards? So I think it's important to consider that it's not just remote proctoring, but what is the sort of remote proctoring, and what else goes with it. And I think it's just important to look into what organizations are doing, before, during, and after, to ensure the security of their tests.
Just launched this week MET Digital. As many may know, but not everybody might know. Are you happy with the security measures in place for the remote administration for MET Digital?
Well, I would say that our digital partner in this case is Prometric, which is has been in the area of computer delivered testing for the longest time. So they really are the gold standard, and we have absolute confidence in what they're doing. But that, as I said, that's not the only thing we're doing. And behind the scenes, we are working, for example, on new statistical malpractice measures that are specifically designed for this new world. Because as you know, MET, when it was delivered on paper, is offered once a month. And right now, MET Digital is going to be available anytime, anywhere. So the way we build the test is different. And the way we go about then evaluating whether somebody might have cheated is also different. But all those different things together, we're pretty confident that we can ensure the integrity of results in our test.
It's good to hear. Thank you. Big relief. Shifting gears a little, what about standards after the pandemic? We're kind of heading into a new context, a new situation now. How do you think the world will change in terms of assessment standards, and what our expectations will be as we head into this new stage?
Well, I think as I was trying to imply earlier, there seem to be incipient moves within the United States to revisit the notion of standards. So personally, as a person with a background in research, I'm actually quite excited because the pandemic, has resulted in a natural experiment, so that if people are careful to preserve their data from the pandemic, there are probably a lot of studies that we can do in order to ascertain whether our standards before the pandemic were actually set in the right place or not. So, some people are admitted on the basis of at-home tests and others in-center tests. Well, how are those two groups comparing, now that they've arrived on campus, and how are all of them doing? Or some people were admitted on the basis of their SAT subject scores, what level appears to actually be comparable to the ones we accept on English proficiency focus tests. So it's a rich opportunity, with all this data to validate both the standardized tests as well as the standards themselves. And, we might find out that in some cases we've set the standards too high, and in some cases we've set the standards too low. And, it doesn't benefit anyone. We'd rather set the standards right at the level they should be at.
Mm-hmm. I've also worked at many different universities in different contexts, always related to very closely to international students. And I've seen many groups of different stakeholders at each institution kind of with completely different opinions in many ways in relation to proficiency standards, English proficiency in particular. We have the recruitment team that wants to offer attractive programs and attract as many students as possible. So standards should be lower in that sense. We have the intensive English program, the teachers, faculty, the directors who will also want to keep attracting students to their programs. So they want standards to be a little higher in some way or appropriate for the university, but they want to help contributing by teaching English. We have faculty who expect at the university who want students to be able to perform all the tasks, all the requirements, to have the level of English proficiency to be able to perform well in class. We have students that want to graduate as soon as possible and finish everything in, a few months. So when defining and looking at all the standards in general that institutions are considering, what should institutions take into account in order to consider these different stakeholder expectations? You were touching on some of those ideas before, but what is kind of the most appropriate mix of options in this case?
You're trying to put me in a very difficult situation here, Fernando, but I think that's a conversation for institutions to have, internally, right? And I would say they have multiple stakeholders internally, right? As you say, the admissions people, the professors themselves, and quite often the people in the intensive English programs. And I think it is up to them to figure out, given the level of English language support they have available on campus, who are the people that they can bring in such that given that level of English language support, they will be able to succeed, right? And I think in that regard, it would be good for people to take a look at some of the literature out there on how quickly people can actually improve within particular defined periods of time when attending intensive English programs. Then that might help people get a more realistic sense of, if I admit somebody at this level, by the time that September rolls along, they won't have arrived at the level they need to be. But if they're at this level, maybe they would be. People might also want to consider whether they want different standards for undergrads and grad students. Ironically, in some cases, I have seen universities where the standard for grad students is somewhat lower. And while this might not be intuitive, there is some wisdom in this for some of them, in that grad students often just focus on one particular disciplinary area. In undergrad, you might take courses across a wide variety of disciplines, but in grad students, you just focus on one area. You already kind of have the vocabulary from your area, and you're mostly interacting with people in your area. So maybe the demands are somewhat less. But it's for institutions to think about, well, what is the reality of English language use in their context, and what can they actually defend? And then they would have to make that decision on, do they err on the side of caution, or on the other side, do you want to have false positives or false negatives?
What are some of the things that you expect will change in assessment practices in the coming years? What's your futuristic mind now?
Well, I don't know how futuristic this is. There have already been some people in the webinar today who've been making predictions, and this is being recorded, so we have to be careful. So I suppose I'll make some of my predictions based on what we're already seeing. So this is not so much the future as it is the present. We are seeing that people are releasing tests that are shorter than in the past, and this will be very interesting to see. To what extent could you shorten an English language proficiency test so that it's convenient for test takers and so on, but at the same time have the level of measurement reliability that you need so that those scores are actually dependable. And I think that's something for people to work through. You can't just shorten a test and expect that the level of reliability is going to be the same. So people might have to consider, are there new ways of doing testing that are indeed shorter, but actually gives good information so that people can meet that particular goal. One other thing that we've also been seeing a lot of lately as a general trend is a shift in emphasis from sanctioning those who fail to helping people. In the K-12 context, there are already accountability tests that are delivered several times over the course of the year, with interim results reported more quickly so that educators can use these to inform teaching and learning. In our case with MET Go, we have a test that provides test takers with personalized feedback about their areas of strengths and weaknesses. We've been seeing formative assessments a lot more, and I expect that this will continue to develop. People are continuing to work on new approaches to measurement that allow us to diagnose these things more accurately and precisely. And I think this is an exciting development that will also be good for learners, teachers, and all those people involved in education.
Great. We're open for questions from the audience. If you have any questions, submit them through the Q&A or the chat even at this point. Something that I had received as an additional question, Gad, was when an institution is looking at a new exam, how should what are some practical strategies that they can follow to define whether it on that new scale, what should be the level that they expect? How can they become familiar with that performance at different levels to decide what is best for them?
The correct answer has to be that an institution should undergo a standard setting process so that they're able to have people within the institution who know the realities within the institution and the stakeholders involved, the students, the professors, and so on. And with that in mind, take a look at the test and see, in fact, this is the level of performance that is likely to result in a cut score, is what we call it, a standard, where somebody who comes in will be able to succeed. So I would absolutely recommend that institutions go through this process, and this is the kind of thing that we can provide people with help and support on if they wanted to run these things by themselves. But if they wanted something that gave them a general sense, nowadays in the field of language testing, everyone has linked their test to what is called the Common European Framework of Reference, which is a 6-level scale in general that gives you a sense of whether somebody is a beginner, an intermediate language speaker, or an advanced language speaker. And on that basis, generally, you're probably able to find out the rough range the rough range of scores that you should be accepting. But again, if you want to narrow that further to something, to a number that you're accepting, then I think you need to go through that standard setting process.
No questions for Gad. Just wanted to say thank you, Fernando, for doing such a great job of moderating the discussions today, and to Julie, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think it's been a really insightful afternoon this afternoon. Of course, we have more tomorrow. We've got a second afternoon tomorrow, or saying afternoon on Eastern time, a second day tomorrow, when we look at some of the other areas connected to international student recruitment and admissions in 2021 and beyond. So we look forward to seeing many of you again tomorrow. Thanks for your time today, and have a lovely afternoon or evening wherever you are. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow.